In mid-2006, a senior doctor of a hospital located in Havlíčkův Brod in the Czech Republic was going over some paperwork of patients that had been admitted to his hospital recently. Almost everything seemed normal, except for one thing that they all seemed to have in common. This was definitely something unusual, and so the doctor wondered if there could be a simple explanation to support his findings. And what the doctor would end up uncovering was way darker and more harrowing than he could ever imagine. But before we get started, my name is Andrea Scott, and I retell scary true stories based on events that you probably have never heard of. A fair warning though, a lot of content is quite graphic, so viewers' discretion is very much advised. And now pour yourself a refreshing glass of pineapple juice and let's get started with today's episode called Running Thin. It was another busy day at the hospital for the senior doctor Pavel Longing. He had just done 2 back-to-back shifts and was really starting to feel the tiredness spreading across his whole body. He looked down at his empty cup of coffee, and for a split second he considered getting another one, but then he stopped himself. He really needed to get back to what he had been doing before he decided to have a quick break. Lately, there was a rise in complications among his patients, and so far, Dr. Longing has not been able to figure out why these complications have been happening. Dr. Longing threw his empty paper cup into the bin and headed for his office. On his way, he scanned the rooms with patients he was passing by, as if to check if he could catch another episode happening right there himself. But the trouble was, he really did not know what he was even looking for himself. In his office, Dr. Longing put the 5 most recent patient cases in front of him and began reading them again. He has done so several times already, yet the causality of their complications still made no sense to him. All these patients had been admitted to the hospital with a range of complications themselves, and none seemed to have a direct link to one another. Yet they all passed away within only a few days from being admitted with symptoms related to poor blood coagulation. In Dr. Longing's expertise, it did not happen that often where patients would end up dying from such complications, and it certainly did not happen often within such a short time frame to so many cases. Apart from these 5 deceased patients, Dr. Longing was also aware of several other cases where patients suffer from the same complications. However, they have managed to recover from them. Dr. Longing frowned and wondered whether this could be caused by some sort of a negligence on the nurse's part. He did not think that someone was actively causing these patients harm, but due to recent short staffing and stretched hours, Dr. Longing thought that it could be possible that someone could have been mistreating patients as a result of being overwhelmed, or perhaps not trained enough to recognize proper dosage of medicine they would have been administering. Dr. Longing decided to take action. He would speak to all the nurses and go over some basic training with them again to help look out for simple symptoms that could lead to potentially larger issues if not treated well, and also reiterate appropriate amounts of dosage to often used drugs. A few days later, Dr. Longing managed to get all his nursing staff together. He began his session by explaining that nobody was in trouble, but that he had to bring the recently deceased cases up, as he still wondered if perhaps something could have been done differently and their deaths could have been prevented. He noticed a few uneasy looks among the nurses, and he could not blame them. After all, this was a highly unlikely situation, and they had never been called together like this before. Dr. Longing stressed the importance of proper preparation of all administered medicine and its dosage, and then he delved into his pre-prepared session. After this class, Dr. Longing hoped his staff would be more careful and that there would be no more deaths from the seemingly same complications, at least not in the near future and across multiple patients in such a short time frame. He knew that anything is possible, but equally he was still under the impression that something else was at play. And unfortunately, he would be right. The early next morning, Dr. Longing's phone went off. There had been yet another death at the hospital, and he was urged to come to the ward right away. The deceased patient was a 60-year-old man that passed away as a result of bleeding out. When they ran further tests, this man's blood ran extremely thin, and even a small cut would have proven to be extremely dangerous to him. Dr. Longing was shocked. This was literally the day after he had trained the staff himself, and he really thought that things at the hospital would improve from there on. Dr. Longing sighed and went back into his office. He sat down and rested his head between the palms of his hands. He was so sure that there would be no new cases, at least not so soon. Yet, he now was dealing with another one. He had no idea where to even begin, as the patient's report looked exactly like the other ones he had studied. The patient was actually on his way to recovery. However, something must have happened overnight, and Dr. Longing wanted so badly to find out what that had been. Over the next few days, Dr. Longing went over all the other reports to see if he could find any more information or clues, but without any luck. He even discussed the situation with senior doctors across the country, but nobody could come up with any new ideas. All patients had no common illnesses or injuries, but all died from practically bleeding out without any clear cause. There were no traces from any suspicious drugs in their system, and so Dr. Longing thought of ruling out external tampering. However, something stopped him. He knew deep down that this was no ordinary situation, and that people do not just pass away from the same symptoms. He just could not see that any of his staff was capable of actually doing anything like that to the patients themselves. He knew everyone he worked with, and he was absolutely sure that everyone was distressed by all of these deaths as he was. Just as Dr. Longing was reading over the staff list, he heard a knock on his door. It was a young nurse who ran across the ward to tell Dr. Longing that another patient was currently being resuscitated and that she was instructed to fetch him right away. Dr. Longing threw the staff list aside and ran after the nurse to the ward, but he was late. The patient had died just a few seconds before Dr. Longing arrived on the ward. It seemed that yet again, the patient bled out on the operating table. Dr. Longing felt a hot wave of anger overcome him. Patients were dying right before his eyes, and he had absolutely no idea why. He felt like he was failing each and every one of them, since he had zero clue of what was actually happening to them. Dr. Longing decided to step away from the situation and exited the room. He leaned on the wall and thought for a second. And just as he was about to leave, he overheard one of the nurses say that this is the 4th time something like this happened while she was working on that ward. And suddenly, Dr. Longing had an idea. He rushed into the reception and pulled out a staffing list together with details of their shifts at the hospital from the past couple of months. Then Dr. Longing went back into his office, sat down at his desk and started cross-checking everyone. When, how long, and the exact days they worked. He knew that this was going to take some time, and he still was not sure if what he was even looking for was going to show up. But at present, he had no other ideas, and so Dr. Longing persevered. It was well into the night when Dr. Longing finished cross-checking several diaries. He was beyond exhaustion at this point, but he also felt like all this work was not for nothing. What now Dr. Longing was looking at was a chart he made that had all the information about every patient that has either died or has been diagnosed with poor blood coagulation. And right along those details was information about every staff member of the hospital that had been involved in treating these patients. And so finally, on 24 September 2006, Dr. Longing was able to piece it all together. It would turn out that all patients did have one thing in common that Dr. Longing firstly overlooked. They were all administered the drug called heparin, which is normally used to thin blood so that it cannot form blood clots or make them bigger. Some of these patients did indeed need the drug in order to be able to recover. However, the dosage was usually too large, and sometimes it was also administered multiple times, which even worsened the patient's state. When Dr. Longing cross-checked the affected patients and the hospital staff, he found multiple people that could have been responsible. But there was only one person that was connected to a staggering 23 cases where the drug had been administered and where a patient either ended up with further complications or passing away. This person was immediately let go, and Dr. Longing alerted the police so that they could make the arrest. Based on further investigation and interviews conducted after the arrest, here is what really happened inside of the hospital in Havlíčkův Brod from early June to late September of 2006. The perpetrator was a very unlikely suspect. They were very well liked at the hospital by just about everyone, and usually had been seen wanting to lend an extra helping hand around. They were particularly interested in patients in a coma or patients with limited awareness. What people did not know that deep down, this person was very disturbed and cherished seeing other people suffering and pain. What particularly made them excited was the fact that they were the only one that knew what was happening to the patient exactly. And they were also the only one who could have helped them. But of course, they did not do that. Instead, they watched silently as these patients battled against the drug that had been administered to them, sometimes even a few times over. The reason the perpetrator almost got away with all of this was that they would administer the drug towards the end of their shift so that the complications would not arise during their time on the ward. The perpetrator was also aware that this drug was commonly used by everyone, and so most likely it would not be flagged as a potential cause of death. What really sealed the killer's fate, however, was the fact that they were the only staff member that was linked to all the drugs overdose in the recent deaths, and also the lack of the drugs overdose across the 3-week period of when the killer took a holiday. When Dr. Longing made this discovery, he first could not believe it, as the person who seemed to have been responsible for all these deaths and suffering was no one other than the extremely liked and caring male nurse, Petr Zelenka. Zelenka had been previously working in other hospitals, but never stayed in one place too long, and usually had issues with his employers, for he was often late or would simply not turn up to his shifts at all. It was not until he joined this very hospital in Havlíčkův Brod, where he seemed to finally find himself, and even took extra qualifications to become a nurse. However, he was a very different person on the inside and behind closed doors. It is believed that his mental state began to really decline in early 2006, due to issues with his partner, and also due to the strained relationship with his father, who did not approve of his life as a gay man. Zelenka also felt that he was going nowhere career-wise, and so he took up drinking heavily and being generally very destructive in his flat. However, these attempts to lash out were not enough, and Zelenka looked for other ways to cause trouble. He settled on administering heparin first in May 2006. Zelenka described the rush he had felt when injecting the patient as something he had never felt before, and that he finally found his calling. He apparently had no idea what the drug would actually do to the patient, but he was excited to find out. The first patient who he injected luckily survived, but his second patient was not so lucky. Zelenka admitted that his victims were chosen so that there would be the least amount of suspicion linked back to him. These patients would usually be in a coma or have been admitted with long-lasting problems, and Zelenka would always administer the drug towards the end of his shift so that the patients would never die while he was working. He loved the fact that he was the only one truly knowing what was wrong with the patient. Zelenka also knew that his reputation was equally not something that would be of concern, because everybody in the hospital seemed to really like him, and so he went on to cause harm and suffering for several months before the chief Dr. Longing began connecting events together. When Zelenka was arrested, it would take another 2 years before the court date was set. But ultimately, Zelenka would be found guilty of murdering 7 people and sentenced to a life in prison with the possibility of parole in 2038. He is currently ranked as one of the worst serial killers in Czech history, due to showing absolutely no remorse for his victims. And he has been commonly referred to as the Heparin Killer, named after the drug he used to harm his victims with. And so this marks the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and if so, then please check out some of my other videos that are already published. I plan on releasing a new video every week, and so I will all see you very soon. Until next time.